This ES6 lesson will highlight the differences between function scope and block scope, followed by the exploration of ES6 constants. In ES5, we used function scope with the var keyword. Variables with function scope are hoisted to the top of the scope, and they are automatically initialized to undefined. Variables can also be redeclared in the same scope. In the first example, you will see these concepts in action. In line 2, guessMe is initialized to 2. Therefore, in the console log statement labeled with A, prints the value 2. Inside the function, a new function scope is created. On line 6, a different guessMe variable is created with the value 5. Therefore, the value of label C should be 5. The D console log should have a value 2 because the internal function scope encapsulates all the variables created there. In line 9, we only have access to the guessMe variable created in line 2. The question is, what should be the value associated with the B label? As you can see, this value is undefined. What is going on here? Well, the mystery can be solved if you take hoisting into consideration. The internal guessMe is hoisted to the top of the function scope and is automatically initialized to undefined. The hoisted variable having an undefined value is accessed on line 5. Let is a new keyword in ES6, giving you the opportunity to create block-scoped variables. Most programming languages use block scope, therefore the concept may be familiar to you. Hoisting still takes place, but block-scoped variables are not auto-initialized to undefined. Redeclaring a block-scoped variable throws an error. Accessing a block-scoped variable before its initialization also throws an error. In the second example, we will use the concept of temporal dead zone to describe the zone where a block-scoped variable cannot be accessed. This example is similar to the previous one. One difference is that we use block-scoped variables instead of function-scoped variables, and we use a block instead of a function to separate scopes. Similarly to the first example, the main riddle will be the B console log. Once we run the code, we can discover that we get a reference error saying that guessMe is not defined. This is because we accessed guessMe in its temporal dead zone. The internal guessMe variable was hoisted to the top of its block scope, but it was not initialized. Accessing a variable inside its temporal dead zone throws an error. You may find the temporal dead zone inconvenient at first sight. Note though that the thrown error grasps your attention a lot better than a silent undefined value. Always be grateful for errors pointing out obvious mistakes during development, as the same mistakes tend to be a lot more expensive once they are deployed to production. The temporal dead zone exists even if a variable with the same name is defined outside the scope of the dead zone. We can get rid of the error by eliminating the reference to guessMe in its temporal dead zone. For a complete reference, the temporal dead zone exists for let, const, and class declarations. It doesn't exist for var, function, and generator function declarations. Declarations with const are block-scoped and they are hoisted similarly to let. The temporal dead zone also exists for constants. The differences are that constants cannot be redeclared and they have to be initialized as soon as they are declared. We will now experiment with constants using the console. After defining a pi constant, you can see that another pi constant can be defined in a different scope. The temporal dead zone doesn't allow us to reference this constant though before its initialization. We can only reference a constant once it's initialized. Whatever was defined inside the scope will stay in that scope. The value of our original pi constant stays intact. A constant cannot be redeclared once it's created. Our reward for trying to redeclare a constant is an error. We will conclude this video with a summary on use cases and best practices. You cannot go wrong with using let and const wherever possible. Although some people will still use var and function scope, using let makes your code slightly more understandable in edge cases. Do understand the differences between var and let though, as you will encounter legacy code from time to time. Always declare and initialize all your variables at the beginning of your scope. If you enforce this practice, you will never have to deal with the dreaded temporal dead zone. You can even set up your linter to enforce this rule. Now that you know everything about var, let, and const, let's jump to the exercises.